The sun had barely begun its descent when I pulled into my driveway, the familiar scent of autumn leaves mixing with the faint tang of my neighbor's barbecue. I had just returned from a grueling 3-day business trip, one of those trips where you feel like a ghost moving through airports, hotel lobbies, and conference rooms, exchanging handshakes and superficial smiles with strangers whose faces would blur together within weeks. My mind was preoccupied with quarterly reports, numbers dancing in my head even as I approached my front door, eager for one simple, unremarkable comfort: a cold beer waiting in my refrigerator. However, told a different story. My silver sedan, always parked in the same place, was gone. In its place sat another vehicle, Brent's car. My son had never come to my house unannounced. A flicker of unease traced its way up my spine as I parked beside it, gripping my briefcase tightly. My hand hesitated over the door handle, my instincts screaming that something was wrong. Before I could knock, the front door swung open, and Della appeared. Her smile stretched across her face in a way that seemed almost painful, too wide and too plastic. "Clark, perfect timing. We have something incredible to share." Her voice was light, almost rehearsed, but something in it felt off. I set my briefcase down in the entryway, a sense of foreboding settling in my chest. Breathtaking. Brent was there too, seated on the living room couch, his hands clasped tightly between his knees. He barely lifted his eyes to meet mine, glancing away almost immediately. On the coffee table lay a spread of brochures, glossy and colorful, promising vitality, health, and wealth beyond imagination. Spiral-bound documents, small bottles labeled with vague wellness claims, income charts showing exponential growth, all designed to lure, entice, and seduce. "What's all this?" I asked, my voice cautious. Della stepped forward, arms wide as if presenting the world itself. "A ground floor opportunity in the wellness industry. This isn't just another business. It's a chance to build real wealth, Clark. Multi-level marketing, done right." I frowned and picked up one of the brochures. The cover featured a smiling family, radiant skin, sparkling eyes, and the kind of wide-toothed grin that made you suspicious of everything behind it. Inside, the pages were filled with before and after photos, testimonials from strangers claiming miraculous results, and charts projecting incomes that seemed almost absurd. My eyes narrowed as I flipped through the numbers. "How much are you asking for?" I finally asked. $45,000, Della replied casually, as if she were mentioning the cost of lunch rather than an enormous investment. "It's an investment in Brent's future, in our future." I looked at Brent. He still wouldn't meet my eyes, staring at a spot somewhere between the carpet and the baseboard. I gestured for Della to give. "Give me the full plan. Let me see the business plan." We moved to the kitchen table, the natural light from the window casting an unforgiving glare on the documents. Della spread them out with constant narration, her words tumbling out like a practiced salesperson. Revolutionary products, unlimited earning potential, and the promise of life-changing success. I put on my reading glasses and began to work through the numbers, line by line, methodically, as I always did. The compensation structure revealed itself quickly. 70% of the projected income depended on recruiting new distributors, each required to buy $3,000 in initial inventory. Fine print indicated that only 2% of participants ever saw a profit. I began scribbling calculations on my notepad, imagining the exponential growth charts. If Brent recruited 6 people, and each of them recruited 6 more, and those recruited 6 more, the math would collapse under its own weight long before the model could sustain itself. By the 7th recruitment cycle, the scheme would have exhausted the entire population of Florida. "This is a pyramid scheme," I said flatly. Della's smile faltered but didn't vanish entirely. "That's what everyone says at first. The people who succeed are the ones who believe, Clark. The top 3% got in years ago. They're the ones making money. You just don't understand modern business." I tapped the page with the income disclosure buried in the small print. "Look at these numbers, Brent. Do you understand what they're showing you?" My son mumbled something incoherent, eyes still averted. I leaned forward. The business model requires an endless supply of new recruits. When that supply runs out, and it always does, the bottom 97% lose their investment. You're asking me to fund your position in that 97%. Do you understand that? Della's voice sharpened. You've never supported us. You sit on your money while we're trying to build something. I felt a cold knot form in my chest. That's not accurate, Della, I said calmly. You've never offered anything without strings attached. Name one time you actually helped us without making us feel like beggars. Her voice escalated, shaking with fury. I rose from my chair and walked to my chair studio. Without a change's relationship, but the room of subjective concrete to they were belong. No, I said mistily. This moving with large relationships and skied for him with large relationships, unfortunately to record nude again. I walked to my home office, returning with a manila folder I had prepared meticulously over the years. Tax prep habits die hard, and I had copies of every financial transaction I had made for them. I spread the documents in chronological order across the kitchen table. Bank statements, canceled checks, loan agreements never honored. March 2022, $30,000 for their house down payment. I never asked for repayment. July 2022, $18,000 for Della's boutique inventory, which closed in 6 months. December 2023, $15,000 for Brent's vehicle when his credit application was denied. April 2024, $17,000 spread across various emergencies and urgent investment opportunities they presented. I arranged them neatly. $80,000 of documented generosity lay in front of them. Della's mouth opened, then closed again, as if she were struck dumb. Brent finally rose but still couldn't meet my eyes. We should go, he muttered quietly. Della grabbed her materials, stuffing them into her bag, spilling papers onto the floor. Neither of them bent down to retrieve them. You'll regret this, Della warned, pointing a finger at me as they exited. I watched them leave, the front door clicking shut behind them. Silence filled the house. My beer still waited in the fridge, cold and oblivious, but the taste of betrayal was stronger, fouling the moment with its bitter tang. My family, the people I had loved and trusted most, had turned against me. And in that instant, I realized that this was only the beginning. Betrayal had settled like a stone in my stone. Betrayal had been levied. The generation, its spiritual to the tack the after with silence of the pieces of model is. Betrayal had settled like a demonstrate there with what we not. Everywhere. Betrayal had settled like this. Betrayal had not to the demonstrate there. By looking for attacks inside, but level love them worked each other to the tack the after with silence. Betrayal had settled like a stone in my chest, and I had no intention of letting it rest there quietly. The morning light streamed weakly through the blinds, cutting thin lines across the kitchen floor where I had left Della and Brent's scattered documents. I brewed a strong cup of coffee, the bitter aroma doing little to chase the tension that had settled over the house like a heavy fog. The previous evening's confrontation replayed in my mind in sharp, unyielding detail. My son had betrayed me. My wife, the woman I had trusted for decades, had colluded in this manipulation. The financial evidence I had laid out, $80,000 in support, in loans I never demanded back, in emergency assistance I had given freely, should have been enough to illuminate the truth. Yet, their betrayal still resonated, like an echo in a vast empty hall. I stared at my reflection in the kitchen window. Clark, I told myself, you've dealt with figures, fraud, and deceit before. But this was personal. There was no hiding behind spreadsheets or audits now. This was family, my own blood, and my gut told me that what had begun as greed was only the surface of a much deeper rot. Expelled beyond Brent's sudden obsession. Over the past few months, he had immersed himself in the wellness opportunity Della so enthusiastically promoted. Calls in the middle of the night, endless online seminars, whispered phone conversations that stopped abruptly when I entered the room. These were not the actions of a young man building a legitimate career. I had tried, subtly at first, to engage him, to guide him, but he always brushed me off. "I just don't get it, Dad. Modern business is different now," he would say, his eyes darting away, hiding from the disappointment in mine. Threatened. Meanwhile, had become a cheerleader and recruiter rolled into one. Her energy, once reserved for family and home, was now consumed entirely by this pyramid of promises. She had pitched me the opportunity herself the night before, her smile stretched too tight, her voice rehearsed to perfection. A carefully constructed mask that concealed ambition, manipulation, and a startling disregard for the reality of the situation. Blazing, in the living room, sitting at the edge of the couch, surrounded by the scattered remnants of brochures, charts, and tiny bottles of what she claimed were miracle supplements. I picked one up, examining the tiny label. Scientific terms wrapped around marketing jargon, vague enough to be meaningless. I placed it back on the table, letting the silence envelop me. The room was thick with the weight of betrayal, and for the first time in decades, I felt powerless in my own home. The sense of disillusionment became acute when I considered the financial implications. $45,000, not a trivial sum, an amount capable of destabilizing a household, especially when funneled into a venture that had the hallmarks of a pyramid scheme. My CPA instinct screamed at me as I reviewed the numbers once more in my head. 70% of projected income came from recruiting more distributors, each required to purchase $3,000 in initial inventory. Only 2% of participants ever turned a profit. The exponential calculations were simple, yet damning. The model collapsed under its own weight, mathematically impossible to sustain. And yet, there they were, naive or willfully blind, ready to risk everything. I rose and began pacing the room, my mind working furiously. Betrayal had many faces, but this was deliberate. The quiet cruelty of involving Brent in a scheme he did not fully understand. The relentless optimism Della displayed while ignoring reality. The sheer audacity to present it as opportunity rather than danger. It was a betrayal layered with intent. I pulled the brochures closer, scanning every page with meticulous attention. Testimonials claimed life-changing results, improved health, financial freedom, personal fulfillment. Charts predicted exponential growth, showing participants earning more than a CEO of a Fortune 500 company in a matter of months. But the fine print, always buried, told a different story. Only a fraction would profit. The rest would lose everything, and when that happened, they would have no recourse. Della had attempted to make me complicit the night before, asking for my investment, framing it as a chance to support Brent's future. She had painted it as family unity, a joint venture toward shared success. But I knew better. This was manipulation at its finest, promising hope while engineering failure, cloaking greed in familial loyalty. Undermined, and then there was Brent, my son, once full of ambition and promise, now a participant in this charade. His silence during the confrontation gnawed at me. He did not defend the scheme. He did not protest when his mother tried to shame me into funding it. He simply sat, shoulders hunched, eyes downcast. It was a betrayal not born of malice but of fear, blind obedience, and misplaced trust. I remembered the whispered confession from the garage the night before. "Our son did it." My wife's words echoed in my mind. 3 days locked in the garage, bruises that traced every movement, exhaustion that consumed her completely. An ordeal I had not fully comprehended until I saw the marks for myself. That she had survived, yet still attempted to manipulate me financially, only intensified my anger. The betrayal had begun physically, but now it had become psychological and emotional. Sitting back down at the kitchen table, I gathered the documents I had left there the night before. Checks, bank statements, loan agreements, all meticulously documented. I spread them out again, a visual map of generosity, evidence of patience and forbearance, a record of support that had been twisted into entitlement by those I loved most. Each document represented not just money, but trust, faith, and decades of commitment. And yet, that faith had been met with deceit. The day stretched on, heavy and suffocating. I barely noticed the clock ticking, so consumed was I by the weight of contemplation. How does one respond to betrayal from those closest to you? How do you confront the people who were meant to be allies in life, now revealed as manipulators? These questions circled endlessly in my mind, demanding answers I did not yet have. By mid-afternoon, I had formulated a plan. Not a reaction, not an emotional outburst, but a calculated approach. This was not merely about money. It was about justice, accountability, and ensuring that the web of deception spun by my wife and son could not continue unchecked. I began making notes, writing down every interaction, every financial detail, every inconsistency. I would need precision. I would need patience. And above all, I would need resolve. Evening fell, casting long shadows across the house. I walked to the garage where the ordeal had begun. Empty now, save for a lingering sense of fear and despair. The space felt like a tomb where trust had died. I ran my hand along the cold walls, remembering the cries, the whispered confessions, and the helplessness in Della's eyes. My anger was no longer raw. It had transformed into something sharper, colder, a tool to be wielded with care. But torsion, I realized, was not just a wound. It was a call to action, and I intended to answer. By nightfall, the house was quiet. The chaos of the previous day had been swept away, yet the emotional wreckage remained. I poured a cup of coffee, stared at the city lights outside my window, and let the first flickers of a plan take shape. Revenge would not be impulsive. It would not be messy. It would be calculated, measured, and inevitable. And I would begin with Brent. The first time I found myself waiting on the porch for someone I had loved to arrive, the world felt inverted, like a photograph turned over to its negative. Light and shadow traded places. The house I had built with careful hands and measured patience now looked unfamiliar, the paint and stone suddenly suspect. I sat on the wicker bench by the door, hands folded, the manila folder of documents beside me like a talisman. Night had given way to a gray morning. The air tasted of rain, and the ache in my chest tasted older than time. They came together, as if choreographed. Brent walking beside Della, her arm looped through his like nothing had happened, as if last week's bruise and whisper in locked garage were details to be glossed over with a smile. They must have rehearsed this, smiling in public, tight-lipped in private. The sight of them made something inside me clench and go cold. "Clark," Della's tone was bright, practiced. "We thought we'd drop by, talk through everything. Sit down?" I did not stand. I did not smile. Instead, I opened the folder and laid the documents out on the porch table, arranging the checks, copies of wire transfers, bank statements, and the printed income disclosure page from the wellness company, exactly as I had the night before. I watched them read, watched the color leave Brent's face, watched the practiced smile dissolve from Della like sugar on the tongue. "You said you needed help, Dad," Brent said first, but his voice was thin, raw. His chin trembled with a mixture of shame and something else I could not name. "You asked me to invest," I said, $45,000, to buy inventory that, according to their own disclosure, the vast majority of participants never sell. "You asked me to buy your entry into a system that mathematically ensures loss unless you're already on top." Della snapped. "Don't lecture me about risk. You don't know what it's like to be stuck in a dead-end job for 35 years. I let that pass. Anger is a tool, and it's useless when baited by cheap accusations. "I told you it was a pyramid. I told you the model was unsustainable. I gave you money before, many times. I don't hide records, I keep them. Do you know why, Brent? Because accountability is the backbone of any family. It's also the backbone of any business." Shaved sighs, a fray of words, but Brent lacked the courage of his mother's fury. He had been subdued, a boy never permitted to be anything but. And now that he stood accused, he folded inward like a map. Della, on the other hand, shifted into offense with the grace of someone who had always played a role better than she had played marriage. You think you can shame us with accounting ledgers? With your neat little checks? You think money explains everything? Maybe you should have been a better father. That cut. Not because it was true, it wasn't, but because pain is often a mirror, and sometimes the mirror shows a face we'd rather not meet. I could have invited her into argument and let words become a knife. Instead, I reached for something more useful. Facts. 3 days ago, you locked her in the garage, I said quietly, naming the offense like a verdict. You beat her. I watched Della's face, and for the first time, there was no training behind it. There was surprise, then a flicker of panic that passed too quickly to be honest. Brent flinched under the accusation like a child startled awake. They denied it. They said it was a misunderstanding, that Della had trapped herself in the garage by mistake, that bruises were from moving boxes, that the whisper was misheard. Their denials were thin, but denials are often a first line of defense for the guilty. I showed them the photos I'd taken that night, the dark purple bloom on Della's arm, the twisted hem of her shirt, the way her hair had been pinned wrong as though it had been forced. I told them what she had whispered, and the sound of their silence told me more than either of their lies. "Why are you doing this?" Brent asked finally, voice small. "What do you want from us?" "Justice," I wanted to say. "Truth, an apology, a reversal." But those were adolescent answers. I was older and my methods had to fit my life. Instead, I said, "I want you to understand what you've done. I want you to repair it, and I want you to stop. You could not fix the past with good intentions, not always. Sometimes the only way to correct a wrong was to architect consequences so inevitable that denial became impossible. I am a numbers man. I understood leverage, pressure, structural failure. Revenge, in my book, would be an engineering problem. Remove the supports, expose the weaknesses, let the construct collapse under its own contradictions. It would not be bloodletting. It would be exposure, law, humiliation in the currency they cared most about, reputation and money. Along I fortified my evidence. I spent the next week cataloging everything, documents, emails, screen recordings of the calls Brent had made to the company's recruitment webinars. He had done these on our home network and I had access. I printed copies of the company's policies, the income disclosure statements, the testimonials that evaporated under scrutiny when traced to stock photographs. I compiled a ledger of the money I'd given them, showing dates, amounts, and, where possible, what the money had been labeled as. I kept a journal of my wife's physical injuries and the statements she offered in the quiet of our kitchen, things she would not say aloud in front of them. All of it was arranged into a neat binder that smelled faintly of coffee and paper, and that knowledge steadied me. Second, I learned the psychology of the network. People like Della and Brent sell hope, not product. They attach dream scenarios to measurable outcomes and then sell responsibility, the idea that failure is personal, not structural. I did not want to argue ideology with them. I wanted to remove the scaffolding of their operation so that ideology would fall flat. If the company was what it claimed, a legitimate wellness opportunity, it would survive scrutiny. If it was built on recruitment and promises, then scrutiny would expose it. I also reached out. The decision to involve others was not a rash one. Revenge is many things, but the most potent revenge is rarely carried out alone. I called old colleagues who owed me favors, a lawyer who had once been a client, a friend at the local paper who liked investigative work, a former client who now sat on the board of a consumer protection association. I did not smear them. I presented evidence and asked questions. I let professionals do what they do. Add legal axes, subpoena power, public interest. When the lawyer looked through my binder, she did not smile. "We can file a civil claim for fraud and infliction of emotional distress," she explained, her tone even. "We can also prepare to contact regulatory authorities about potentially deceptive trade practices. But be advised, these matters can get messy. They also get results if you have the documentation." She set a stack of forms on the table. If you want them held accountable, you'll want to be prepared to amass evidence and present it clearly. Admiration, I thought. I had been prepared for the better part of a decade. I was prepared now. In the meantime, I used what I could without the court's hammer. Exposure in the places that mattered. The friend at the paper agreed to run a blind story about how these companies operate, their fee structures, and the testimonies of people ruined by them. The consumer protection guy offered to take our story to a local consumer advisory board. I left anonymity and let the facts breathe. I did not show my hand entirely. I fed pieces, strategic little leaks that would orb through the family's social circles and the company's internal networks like small, precise charges placed to weaken a structure later. Blitzla reacted like someone who had been punched in a soft place. Her calls came at all hours. Her voice was alternately pleading and venomous. "You're ruining us," she told me in one call. "You're destroying our life." It was hard to hear without laughing. Destroying a life that had so casually disregarded the life of the woman who had been locked in a garage. But laughter would have been a betrayal of the seriousness of the harm. Brent, for his part, began to avoid the house. He sent me sparse texts. "I'm sorry, I didn't know. I'll make it right," that read like petitions from a frightened child. I chose to meet him once, under the quiet dignity of a small cafe, where the walls absorbed sound and people's awkwardness could be secreted away. He sat across from me, thumb worrying the rim of his coffee cup. "I didn't mean for any of it to go that far," he said. "I didn't lock her. I only left her there and she—" He faltered. "Turbulence is negligence," I answered. "Active cruelty is active cruelty. There's both here." I could see the conflict in him, a flaring awareness of culpability and a reflexive loyalty to the person who had been father and mentor. "Do you want to make amends?" Swallowed. "Yes, I don't know what to do." "Start by telling the truth," I said. "Start by acknowledging what happened to your mother. Stop with the recruitment. Help me undo what's been done." He nodded slowly. Perhaps he was terrified of losing his mother, or terrified of losing me. I could not be certain. People in these positions often respond to different levers: shame, fear, hope. I held out to him a different choice: cooperation. If he helped us by giving testimony, by surrendering evidence he had on his phone and accounts, by appearing willing to cooperate in a civil inquiry, the court of public opinion and the court of law might treat him differently than if he continued to hide. There was a trade-off in every society that valued order. Confession, cooperation, and restitution were softer on the soul than duplicity braided with arrogance. He'd cooperate, but not fully. He gave me access to some chat logs, some message threads where recruiters had coached him on how to handle skeptical parents. He confessed to fostering an environment of denial in the house when I was away. Small lies that multiplied into a monstrous culture of obfuscation. It was enough to help shape the narrative into something prosecutable, something that would show pattern and intent rather than a single, isolated incident. Dela, when she found out, raged. She called lawyers of her own, then backtracked when I let it be known my own attorney had grassroots support and the weight of a respected consumer columnist. The stakes, to them now, were not only the money, but reputation and access. They had banked on my inertia. They had counted on my reluctance to make waves. How odd, I thought, that the people who demanded risk only ever expected others to take it. The first public rupture came at a company meeting, a regional gathering where recruits arrived with shiny brochures and hope. I did not attend. I hired a freelance investigator to pose as a distraught recruit. He asked probing questions, recorded promises, and gathered documentation on how the company handled refunds, inventory returns, and downline obligations. The investigator passed the materials to my attorney, who then coordinated with the consumer columnist to run an overview of the company's practice, the math, the promises, the human cost. The story mentioned anonymous victims. It mentioned how the company's own disclosure rendered most participants losing parties. It did not mention names at first. It did not have to. The ripples were immediate. Recruiters started receiving emails from people who had been burned by the opportunity. A private group chat where Brent had been active turned hostile with accusations. The company's support line suddenly tasted of mounting complaints. Dela's posts, once effusive with promises and smiling photos, began to attract skeptical comments and calls. When the call came from Brent's upline, an older woman with a voice like brittle glass, she demanded to know who had leaked the story. I told them nothing, but I did not need to. Panic makes people careless. A parent guilty of stacking boxes in a garage will misstep when afraid. Shields. They made mistakes. They tried to double down on their narrative, to brand the story as a smear campaign against a legitimate opportunity. They held video calls and rallied their most ardent supporters. But every defensive action forced them to reveal more internal materials. Product returns were delayed. Refund policies were ambiguous. The testimonials could be tracked to paid actors. The legal pressure was practical and methodical. We weren't out to ruin anyone's life for pleasure. We wanted accountability and reparation. But in truth, I also wanted them to feel the consequence of the wound they had opened in our home. Threatened. Atlantic. Della came to the house, eyes rimmed with tiredness, hair a tangled halo around her face. She came not in the practiced recruitment mode, but small and raw, as if she had realized the scale of the collapse and felt it slam into her own chest. "Please," she whispered, "we can fix this. I'll come clean to the company. I'll do anything." Shameful. "Fix what?" I asked. "The money? The bruises? The trust?" Sebastian. She had no answer for the bruises. She had no answer for the trust. But she promised, again and again, to cooperate, to return the funds if the company allowed it, to quit the network, to seek help. Whether she meant it or whether it was merely another attempt to control fallout, I could not tell. People, when cornered, often promise anything to find a way out. IMD Shimmer. The legal processes move slowly. It's the nature of law. In the meantime, the social consequences did their work. Members in her downline defected. Her top recruits, sensing instability, looked for other opportunities. Brent's position slipped beneath him like a poorly stacked shelf. Shame arrived in small, invasive ways. A friend's cold shoulder at a social event. A call from a neighbor asking whether it was true. Yet through all of this, there was an ugly, persistent knot of something I had not counted on. Grief. Revenge may be a rational act, but it does not erase the ache of betrayal. Every paper served, every public mention, every fractured relationship cut at me too. The house felt emptier, not fuller. There were nights when I would wake up and find Della's chair empty, and the space where she slept looked like a missing tooth in a smile. I missed who she had been in simpler times, before ambition and entitlement and the hunger for instant fortunes had gnawed at our family. And still, I continued. Not because I loved litigation or gossip, but because leaving their behavior unpunished would have been acquiescence, and I could not afford to teach that lesson. My method was surgical. Evidence, exposure, the law. The wave I had started was not unkind, precisely. It was proportional. It was, perhaps, what American justice sometimes looks like when wielded by someone who knows numbers and is not afraid to use them. By the time the company's legal counsel sent a cease and desist to my attorney, the drumbeat of public inquiry had already shifted. Regulators reached out to us. The local consumer board asked for documentation. A radio host called and asked if I would share my story anonymously. I refused anonymity. It no longer felt necessary. Things which hide in shadows thrive. Light makes them squirm. Brent came back to the house one afternoon, hair unwashed, eyes hollowed. He stood in the doorway and for a long time did not cross the threshold. The man who had once been a son now looked like a stranger moving through the ruins of his own making. "I want to help," he said finally. I put down the paper I had been reading and regarded him. This confrontation had not been about vengeance for spectacle's sake. It was about creating a space where truth mattered. "Then tell the truth," I said. "Tell them what you took, who coached you, and what you knew. Help us show the world how this thing works." He agreed. He spoke with the authorities. He gave up his accounts. He, even then, hesitated where true courage was required, glancing once toward the door as if some invisible leash still held him. But the chain had been weakened. It would not be whole again. We were not done. There would be hearings, depositions, small-town gossip, and broken friendships. There would be nights I lay awake and wondered whether any of this would bring Della back to the person she had once been. There would also be the simple, necessary satisfaction of seeing a structure built on exploitation begin to fail under scrutiny. The house felt colder that winter, but it felt honest. The confrontation had done what I had intended. It had named the betrayal, organized the facts, and set into motion a process that would hold people accountable. The method was neither cruel nor loving, but it was fair in the only way that mattered. It was anchored in truth. When the knock came, the one that would bring a formal summons and the first taste of institutional consequence, I opened the door without fear. The ledger in my hand was heavy. The air smelled like rain and paper and the inevitable. The binder sat on my desk like a small, innocuous bomb. Neat, calfskin, edges unfrayed, the ink still smelling faintly of the late-night coffee I had poured while assembling it. Every check, every transfer confirmation, every notation had been filed with the same obsessive care I had once reserved for clients' audits. The difference now was personal. These documents were not about corporate compliance or quarterly results. They were a ledger of my life, my attempts to keep a family afloat, the trust I had extended in good faith, the investments I had made in other people's futures. It was proof they could not swallow with denials. Clang the pages slowly, as if by handling the paper gently the memories might not flay me raw. March 2022, $30,000. An earnest, hand-delivered check in a brown envelope for their house down payment. July 2022, $18,000. A wire to Della's boutique supplier that vanished into a failing business she had named with pride. December 2023, $15,000. A loan that bought a vehicle intended to carry Brent to work and interviews. April 2024, $17,000. Storm damage that needed immediate repair. Emergencies that made faces gaunt and nights long. Each entry had a note in my handwriting. Gift. Loan, no terms. For Brent. Use for repairs. I had not expected gratitude. I had expected honesty. Instead, I had gotten silence, anger, and a scheme that bartered our family's future for false hope. By the time dawn crept through the blinds and cast its thin, indifferent light across the desk, the binder was closed and a plan, a different one, had begun to take shape. The law had its rhythms, and public opinion had its capillaries. Both required nourishment, both required fuel. Evidence had to be irrefutable. Narratives had to be simple and true. I could manufacture neither anger nor compassion, but I could make the facts unavoidable. I began with the small things, receipts and photo evidence. I pulled up the messages Brent had sent through the home Wi-Fi, late-night recruitment pep talks, screenshots of the company's back-office dashboards, messages in which recruiters coached him on what to say to skeptical family. I took high-resolution photos of Della's bruises, the kind that would make no sense as the accidental consequences of packing boxes. I compiled medical notes Della had been too ashamed to show them publicly. I dated everything, time-stamped everything. The binder grew heavier, but the work made me feel steady again. When I met with my lawyer, an old client turned friend who understood the slow, patient cruelty of fraud, she scanned the binder and nodded once. "You've done the hard part," she said. Her voice was businesslike, devoid of pity. "Now we organize it for the people who make decisions. Regulators, judges, a jury if it comes to that. We'll file a civil complaint for fraud and unjust enrichment. We'll coordinate with the State Consumer Protection Agency. If the company's operations cross certain boundaries, we can alert the Attorney General's office. This is not just about the money. It's about deceptive trade practices and the emotional harm done to your household." Deceptive trade practices. The phrase landed in my head and stayed. I had spent a life describing numbers as either honest or dishonest. This company, this camouflage of wellness, of opportunity, wore numbers like masks. Under them was something ugly and efficient. We filed. Papers were stamped. A summons was prepared. The first legal push was deliberate and cold, an instrument of pressure that did not require loud proclamations, but instead relied on bureaucracy and the slow hum of institutions that prize documentation. The company's counsel answered with the predictable formalities: denials, requests for extensions, claims of legitimate business practices. They had a lawyer who knew the dance. I had a lawyer who knew how to make sure the dance left them exposed. Parallel, I fed the journalist friends small, verifiable pieces of the story. I refused sensationalism. The truth, once organized, needed no hyperbole. The columnist wrote with the calm cruelty of someone who understood the public's appetite for accountability. He wrote about business models that relied on recruitment rather than product, about how before and after photographs masked non-representative anecdotes, about how communities were hollowed out not by malice alone, but by the tidy belief that success could be bought with a single check. The column did not name Della or Brent at first. It did not need to. It was a spotlight, and once lights were turned on, Mold got nervous. The response was predictable and devastating in equal measure. The company's recruitment forums, places I had once scrolled through to understand their pitch, erupted in whispers. Downline members began private chats that quickly turned into frantic questions about refunds, inventory returns, and a suddenly skeptical leadership. My phone, professional, reserved, used for audits and polite client calls, began to fill up with messages I never wanted to read. Neighbors asking if it was true, former friends making awkward small talk about rumors, and an ex-colleague who had once admired my stability, admitting they had seen similar schemes ruin others. Della's face became unreadable. She oscillated between brittle rage and abject fear. In the privacy of our kitchen, she argued and pleaded and then cried. She promised restitution and vowed to resign from the company. But promises, especially those born from panic, bore little weight with me. Words were what had gotten us into this mess. Proof would be what dug us out. The more I pushed, the more brittle their composure became. Brent, always hesitant in confrontation, began to fray at the edges. He had never been the architect of this scheme in the way Della had been, the recruiter, the promoter, the smile behind the testimonials. But he was complicit. His name had been attached to recruits. His bank accounts contained transfers from the company. Small amounts at first, commission for an early recruit, then larger sums when he rose to a mid-level position in their structure. I traced the money with the same patience I had once used to parse tax returns. Patterns emerged. Funds flowed from customers to distributors to regional hubs, then back in small, opaque rebates. It was not necessarily illegal in every instance, but it was morally corrosive and ripe for regulatory scrutiny. I used my access to do what a good CPA does: follow the money. I cross-referenced transfers, read the memos, and found the tickets that suggested the company had encouraged inventory purchases that were non-refundable and non-returnable. I found recruitment scripts that expressly told people not to discuss refund policies and to frame the investment as a personal commitment to health and financial freedom. Where there was room for interpretation, I looked for intent. Where there was ambiguity, I documented it. Clarified is not just documents and numbers. It's stories that the documents can confirm. I began to gather both. I reached out quietly to a few other recruits, people who had been coaxed into investing with promises of quick returns, but who had found themselves unable to sell inventory or recruit effectively. Some were embarrassed, some were vindictive. A few were ready to talk because they too had been hurt. Their accounts, paired with my financial trail, formed a coherent narrative. The company's structure pushed for recruitment. The risk was borne by the bottom, and promises were built on selective testimonials that evaporated under scrutiny. Windshield wipers. The investigators' report came back. an independent third party who had posed as a recruit and documented practices. The picture sharpened. Return policies were vague. Inventory buy-in requirements were inflexible. The income proofs touted in training were either years old, misattributed, or based on outliers who had been leaders for a decade and had benefited from recruiting long before my family had walked in. The investigators' audio files captured training sessions where recruiters were coached to overcome objections and to frame skepticism as a lack of belief rather than a rational concern about math. I sent all of this to my attorney. She sat across from me, palms on the binder, and folded her fingers. "We have enough," she said. "We can make a credible case to the Consumer Protection Agency and to the civil court. Expect the company to respond with its own counsel, and expect them to try to discredit recruits who talk. That's standard. But your documentation is meticulous. You did what most people don't. You kept receipts." The legal machinery churned. Papers were served. Depositions were scheduled. The company sabered with its own strategies, but every time they tried to deflect, another piece of evidence landed in their path. A subpoena for their sales records was issued. Their counsel produced glossy brochures and a glossy presentation, but the raw ledgers showed the discrepancies that brochures did not. Cancellations refused, refunds stalled, and credit card charges for mandatory starter packs that came with no reliable path to resale. Regulators took note. Yet the process was not purely mechanistic. It touched people in ways a spreadsheet cannot convey. At PTA meetings, conversations that had once been pleasant became tentative. At the country club, nods turned to careful distance. Our social calendar, something I had once thought trivial, began to look peppered with absences where there had been once abundance. Reputation, that intangible currency, was shifting like sand beneath a house. Mitt's Epsilon Della descended into a private spiral I did not fully recognize. Outwardly, she made good on some promises. She removed her posts, called a handful of recruits to apologize, and publicly announced she would pause her involvement pending the outcome of the inquiry. Privately, she was a different storm. Frantic, pleading, alternately accusatory and contrite. There were nights she would sit at the kitchen table and stare at the ledger of what I had given them, unable to form words that held any meaning. "I thought I was helping," she whispered once. "I thought I was building something for us." Her voice was so small then, it scarcely reached the edges of the kitchen. "No," I said. It was true, in part. I had believed at times she wanted something real, independence, a taste of success on her own. But belief and method are different things. The method she had chosen cut other people, including me, and damaged the person she claimed to love more than anyone else. Brent's fall was quieter but no less certain. His friends began to drift away as money dried up and trust soured. One of his early recruits, a young woman who had mortgaged a savings account to buy inventory, confronted him at a local coffee shop. Her voice shook. She'd been promised mentorship and support. Instead, she had been left with boxes of product and a ledger full of negative balances. "You told me you'd help," she said to him. He had no defense beyond the hollow apologies of someone learning that optimism cannot always be weaponized into income. And yet there were nights, as the legal team prepped filings and as deposits and subpoenas marched steadily onward, when my satisfaction at seeing justice take shape mixed with a gnawing remorse. These were not people entirely different from the ones I had married and fathered. The woman who sat across from me, hands trembling, was the person who had once laughed at my worst jokes and baked pies for holiday dinners. The son who now looked smaller in my living room had once been a boy who had learned to ride a bike in the driveway, falling and getting back up with scraped knees and resilient hope. The ledger and the litigation could not put back what was broken, but they could prevent the exploitation from continuing. A turning point arrived on a rainy afternoon when the state consumer protection officer called me. "We've opened an inquiry," she said, her voice crisp with bureaucratic satisfaction. "Based on the documentation provided and the patterns we see in the investigators' report, we're going to subpoena certain company records. We may also be considering a civil enforcement action. Thank you for your thoroughness. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. Institutions, slow, cumbersome, and easily bored, had finally been engaged. The company reacted predictably, but with a ferocity I hadn't fully anticipated. Their regional director began to call mutual acquaintances, pushing a narrative of family dispute and vindictive aging father, who refused to see the modern opportunities available to the younger generation. They circulated emails that minimized the issue and framed refunds as policy compliant. For a moment, their defense was almost convincing. The public always loves a redemption arc, and many will choose to believe what soothes them. But facts, once they existed in the documents and voices we had assembled, were stubborn things. Testimonies from other recruits, people who had faced similar issues in different states, began to surface. The local columnist ran a follow-up, not a scream headline, but a careful, point-by-point analysis that tied the company's claims to the investigators' findings and to my documentation. The tenor shifted. What had been whispers turned into cautionary consultations. Neighbors who had once been friendly began to ask how to protect themselves and their families. Inside our house, the atmosphere changed in small but fundamental ways. Della no longer wore the bright dresses she'd used in recruitment photos. She grew quieter, more reflective. Sometimes she would sit across from me in the late evening and we would talk, not about the company, not about legality, but about small things that felt like the scaffolding of a life. The way the light hit the breakfast table in the morning, Brent's stubbornness, the way our daughter used to draw outside the lines. These conversations, fragile as they were, felt like beginnings of a different kind of repair. She did not ask me to stop the legal process. She knew, with the clarity born of consequence, that some things could not unhappen. And yet not all wounds could be stitched with restitution or court orders. Some trembled in the undercurrents of everyday life, appearing in the vacant seat at a family dinner, or in the way a mutual friend's eyes slid past you at a gathering. I found myself learning that accountability carries with it the weight of loneliness. It demands that you watch, sometimes in silence, as the consequences you set in motion ripple outward into lives that remain, in many ways, your own. Days passed in a calculus of small victories and public exhaustion. We obtained records. Depositions were transcribed. The state examined policy documents and compared them to the claims made at recruitment seminars. Some recruits came forward and spoke with the authority of experience, how they had been told to hide fees, how they had been told to frame inventory as a necessary step, how they had been promised income that was the product of rare outliers. The company countered with glossy marketing and a tight PR response. But the pattern, the structure that relied on persistent recruitment and inventory buy-in, was becoming clearer to anyone willing to look. In the quiet moments, when the house settled and the rain left the gutters hissing, I would return to the binder. I would trace the ink of my own pen and feel both vindication and sorrow. Proof of generosity, I had written in the margins of a check once. Proof of generosity now felt like an indictment and an offering. The same gesture that had once been a bridge could, when abused, become a noose. The ledger was no longer simply numbers. It was the map of a relationship, what had been given, what had been taken, and the difficult arithmetic of making things right again. Towards the end of the chapter in our lives that this binder represented, there were small signs of change. One of Della's top recruits sent a message saying that she was closing her account and returning unsold inventory. Another emailed to request instructions on refunds. Brent began attending mandated seminars with legal counsel, listening to the vocabulary of accountability with a slow, dawning comprehension that felt like adult knowledge arriving late but earnest. I would not claim mercy had entered our home, that would be dishonest. But the machinery of consequence had begun to do what it does. It had made the cost of exploitation visibility, and it had forced people to reckon. On the morning the consumer protection officer rang the doorbell to take sworn statements, Della stood beside me and wrapped her hand around mine. It was not a gesture I could fully trust. Old patterns die hard. But it was real. We walked up the steps together, hands tight, and I felt a strange mixture of fatigue and clarity. The ledger I carried felt lighter in that moment, not because the burden had been lifted, but because the ledger had finally found a place where it could speak. Amplified proof of generosity had been my shield once. Now, in the way of things, it had become our tool. The house hummed with the ongoing soundtrack of depositions, phone calls, and the distant, steady clatter of reputation being reconstituted. There would be hearings and perhaps settlements, maybe even apologies. There would be long nights and uneasy mornings. But there would also be, for the first time in a very long while, a measure of accountability that might, if time proved generous, allow us to begin the slow work of rebuilding what had been broken. That afternoon, when I put the binder back on the shelf, I felt neither triumph nor ruin. I felt only the forward motion of necessary things, of papers filed and questions asked, of truth arranged and left to stand in the light. The bill of our family's debts, emotional and financial, had not been paid in full. But for the first time since I had found Della in the garage, the balance sheet of our lives did not look entirely hopeless. The house felt colder that morning, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the tension and whispered it back in thin, sharp lines. I moved through the rooms like a man learning the language of shadows. Every creak of floorboard underfoot reminded me of the past weeks, the garage, the bruises, the ledger of generosity I had laid bare. The confrontation, the legal filings, the mounting public scrutiny, they had begun to alter the atmosphere. It was no longer a home. It was a stage, and we were all actors forced to reckon with the script written by betrayal. Brent was downstairs when I arrived, hunched over his laptop, scrolling through the company's private forums. His shoulders slumped in the way of someone carrying an invisible weight too heavy to bear. I watched him for a long moment, calculating the balance of fear, guilt, and pride. He looked up briefly, eyes darting away the instant they met mine. "Brent," I said, my voice even but hard, "we need to talk about your role in this." He sriggled, fingers curling around the edge of the keyboard. "I know, Dad. I didn't understand at first. I just thought I was helping, you know." His voice cracked in a way that made my chest tighten. "You weren't helping," I said. "You were participating in a structure that benefits the top 3% and destroys everyone else's investment. And you failed to see that for months, even when the evidence was clear." Stiffness. He nodded, silent, and I let him sit there a moment longer, absorbing the weight of my words. I wanted him to understand that this was not just about money. It was about trust, about choices, about the consequences of participating in manipulation. Della entered the room quietly, her face pale, lips pressed tightly together. She had been avoiding direct eye contact, hovering near the doorway, like a general unsure if she should advance or retreat. "We're going to make things right," I said. "But right now, that starts with transparency. I want every contact you have in this company. I want records, messages, emails, everything. Nothing is too small. If you hold back, you will only prolong your own suffering." Della flinched but did not protest. Brent's fingers hesitated over the keyboard before he began compiling files, dragging folders onto an external drive I had brought. I could see the relief mixed with fear in his movements. Relief at being finally guided, fear at the consequences that were now unavoidable. Over the next few days, I began sending carefully curated documents to my lawyer. She responded with precise instructions, outlining the sequence of regulatory submissions and civil complaints. Each step was deliberate. Each action had purpose. There would be no shouting, no dramatics, only the methodical application of evidence and consequence. Late one afternoon, I sat in my study reviewing the records Brent had handed over. Emails between Della and her recruits revealed coaching on persuasion techniques, scripted responses to skeptical parents, and manipulative framing that minimized risk while promising massive returns. Screenshots of internal company spreadsheets exposed the unequal distribution of profit and the constant pressure to recruit. These were the tools of exploitation. I felt a quiet satisfaction as I traced the money flow and lined it up against their own words. The deception was systematic, and now, thanks to their carelessness and my meticulous tracking, it was exposed. This was not revenge in the traditional sense. It was justice engineered with precision. That evening, I called Brent into the kitchen. The rain outside pattered against the windows, a soft drumbeat underscoring the tension between us. "You understand what happens next," I said. "The legal process will move slowly. There will be discomfort, there will be confrontation, and there will be consequences. But if you cooperate fully, you have a chance to mitigate the damage." Silent, his face drawn. "I will. I'll do whatever it takes." Good, I thought. That was the first step. But I knew the real work was only beginning. The next moves had to be precise, like chess. Every decision, every piece of evidence, every legal motion would push Della and Brent closer to accountability, closer to the consequences of their choices. That night I sat alone in the living room, reviewing the day's progress. The binder, the external drives, the compiled evidence, they all represented the culmination of careful planning and unwavering resolve. Outside, the storm had settled, leaving a calm that belied the upheaval within. I poured a glass of water and let it sit on the table, untouched. Revenge, I realized, was not about anger or spite. It was about restoring balance, exposing truth, and ensuring that those who had betrayed and harmed others could not continue unchecked. And now, with the evidence secured and the legal machinery in motion, that process had begun. Tomorrow, I would take the next steps. Contacts would be made, statements would be filed, and the slow, inevitable pressure on Della and Brent would continue until the weight of their actions could no longer be ignored. For the first time since the garage, I felt a sense of control. The storm of betrayal had begun to clear, replaced by the steady, precise work of holding people accountable. And I would not stop until every consequence was realized, every lie exposed, and every act of manipulation met with its proper outcome. By the time the subpoenas arrived, the house had already changed its shape in my mind. It no longer felt like a place that simply sheltered us. It was now a ledger of actions and consequences, each room a line item in a much larger accounting. The legal papers, crisp and official, sat on the entry table like a verdict waiting to be read. When Della opened the envelope and saw the state seal, the color drained from her face. In the way ink bleeds into paper, smiling. At response was immediate and theatrical. Della lashed out with public statements on the company's forums, denials wrapped in the language of victimhood, and tried to rally her downline with calls to loyalty. But loyalty, built on recruitment, collapses quickly when the backbone of that loyalty is fear of loss. As recruits began to read the subpoenas and the investigators' report, their conversations shifted from optimistic to anxious. Refunds were suddenly more important than mentorship calls, and the carefully curated images of smiling success were replaced with threads about bank accounts and blocked phone numbers. Brent went quiet. He began attending depositions, eyes hollow but hands steady when producing documents. Watching him move through those rooms, small civic spaces where a stranger in a suit read aloud the contents of his messages, felt like watching a child grow up too fast. His cooperation, partial at first and then more complete, became the fulcrum of the case. He handed over chat logs that named recruiters, group calls that coached new members to ignore refund policies, and lists of recruits who had been targeted with high-pressure tactics. Each piece of evidence tightened the net. Collisions. Thaw is a peculiar sound to public accountability. Not the banging of a gavel, but the low, grinding chorus of institutions doing their work. Regulators requested records. The company produced glossy marketing decks. It could not produce the refunds it had quietly promised recruits in private messages. A pattern emerged, one the state took seriously. when a recognizable structure pushed product buy-ins as the primary path to income, and when internal communications equated commitment with non-refundable inventory purchases, the law took an interest. Shimmer. Veneer crumbled in stages. At first it was defensive posture. Blame the father. Blame the media. Then came fatigue. A hollow laugh in the kitchen. Late-night pacing. Frantic texts she sent and then deleted. When a neighbor called to ask if we were okay, she answered in a voice that betrayed her panic. The social scaffolding that had supported her had shifted. Friends who had once cheered her posts quietly stepped back. Reputation, once a soft currency, was suddenly scarce. Jong in the raw, thin light before the house settled into night, Della knocked on my study door. She entered without ceremony and sat opposite me, hands clasped so tightly the knuckles shone white. For a long time she said nothing. The air between us hummed with the unspoken ledger of pain. Pem, Sizlik. I didn't mean for it to go this far, she whispered. It was faint, almost a confession thrown into a room full of echoes. Shields. You didn't mean for her to be hurt, I said slowly. You didn't mean for this family to be rearranged into ruins. The words were a ledger, simple, unforgiving. She lowered her gaze. There was a moment, fleeting, fragile, where I saw the woman I had once known, tired, frightened, and capable of remorse. She promised to testify to the company's internal coaching methods. She offered to participate in restitution talks and to contact recruits personally to apologize. Her remorse felt like a thin thread, real perhaps, but not yet strong enough to hold. I listened, partly because truth matters, and partly because there was practical utility in her cooperation. The state would consider her willingness to assist when they weighed charges and remedies. Meanwhile, the community began to fracture in ways I had not anticipated. Friends called with caution in their voices. Social invitations dwindled. Even my accountant clients, men and women I had worked with for years, began to angle conversations away from family and toward quarterly forecasts. There was dignity in discomfort. There was also cruelty. The cost of accountability was not only borne by those who had acted, but also by the people around them. That was one of the heavier, quieter lessons of all this. Justice is often noisy, but its ripples fell into the most mundane ponds. Legal maneuvers intensified. Depositions, sworn statements, records requests. The machinery moved with the deliberate pace of a well-oiled bureaucracy. The company's counsel attempted to discredit recruits who came forward, painting them as jealous ex-partners or unlucky entrepreneurs. The press fed on drama, but the local columnist kept a disciplined eye on the facts. As more recruits came forward, the narrative shifted from isolated misfortune to systemic pattern. The state's interest deepened. Consumer protection officers, usually indifferent to the weather of local business, started to ask pointed questions. Tightened. Stet, to his credit, made difficult choices. He agreed to sit for a recorded interview with the regulatory team, answered questions honestly, and identified people who had coached him. He met, awkward and ashamed, with recruits he had once encouraged. Their faces, once bright in his memory, were now maps of loss, bank statements, unpaid credit card bills, boxes of unsold goods. Some forgave him, others did not. Forgiveness, I learned, is not a currency that can be demanded or purchased. As the net tightened, Della became both penitent and ferocious. She swung between attempts to fix things and bitter defenses. One night she shredded old recruitment materials into the kitchen trash, a small, symbolic act that felt both performative and necessary. "I'll make calls," she told me, voice trembling. "I'll tell them the truth." In some calls she was sincere. In others, old habits reared, her instinct to sell, to spin, to persuade. Habit is a hard thing to unthread. The legal process, mercifully, began to yield results. The state issued a notice requiring the company to offer standardized refund processes and to stop certain inventory mandates while audits were conducted. The company pushed back, naturally, but regulators had enough evidence to demand changes. A mediation room was scheduled where companies like this often offered settlements to avoid prolonged public scrutiny. I was not naive about settlements. Money could buy silence, and the injured often found themselves bargaining for a fraction of what they had lost. Yet the public remedies, policy changes, consumer education, enforceable refund windows felt, in their way, like structural corrections that might protect someone else's family in the future. In the small hours, after hearings and calls and long days of paperwork, I would sit alone and think about the paradox of it all. The fight for accountability had cost me as well. Late-night guests no longer came. Dinner invitations thinned. I missed the ordinary discomforts of family life, the petty annoyances and the small reconciliations that make marriage durable. There were times I wondered if a quieter path might have spared us this fallout. But then I would think of the bruises and the whispered confession in the garage, and know there was no other way. When mediation day arrived, Della sat beside me in the witness room, hair pulled back, hands folded. She testified to her actions, to the coaching script she had used, and to the pressure she had felt from above. Brent, present and pale, answered questions about his participation. The company, faced with mounting evidence and the state's leverage, offered a settlement that included a structured refund program and mandatory changes to sales practices. It was not full reparation, never is, but it was tangible change. It was, perhaps, the closest thing to justice that institutions can reliably deliver. Rules rewritten so the structure cannot so easily be used again. After the hearing, as we walked back to the car, the air felt thin and bright. The house, when I returned that night, seemed quieter not from absence, but from a kind of recalibration. There was damage that could not be undone, trust that would have to be rebuilt slowly, brick by cautious brick. But there was also a sense that a dangerous cycle had been interrupted. Reckoning, I realized, does not always look like dramatic punishment. Often it looks like the ordinary work of regulation, the paperwork that forces transparency, the slow grind of accountability. It looks like recruits calling their families to explain, like refund checks issued months later, like a company changing its practices under legal insistence. It looks like people learning hard lessons in public. I poured a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table, the ledger closed before me. There would be one more chapter to write in this book of rupture and repair. Whatever came next, I knew now that consequences could be engineered with patience and evidence. I also knew that even the cleanest bookkeeping could not account for the small, ragged things, memory, shame, and the slow, difficult work of forgiveness. Morning sun filtered through the blinds, soft and impartial, as if it had no memory of the chaos that had passed. The house felt different now, less like a battleground and more like a space holding its breath. Weeks of legal maneuvering, depositions, and mediated settlements had left Della and Brent quieter, subdued, carrying the weight of their actions in ways that couldn't be erased. Tempt first, moving with a tentative caution I had rarely seen in him. His shoulders were straighter, though the guilt still shadowed his face. "Dad," he said quietly, I understand now. I need to fix things, for everyone I hurt." I nodded, letting the words hang between us. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but acknowledgement was a start. "Actions matter more than words, Brent," I replied. "The ledger of our lives doesn't forget what we've done, but it can remember what we choose to do next." Della appeared behind him, tentative but present. The bruises on her arms had faded, replaced by a quiet pallor that spoke of sleepless nights and remorse. She met my gaze briefly, her lips pressed in a line of silent apology. No dramatics, no excuses, just a recognition of the past and the weight it carried. The company had issued its revised policies, and refunds had begun to trickle to affected recruits. The state's oversight ensured compliance, and while the restitution was partial, it was real. The structural changes promised accountability, ensuring that other families would not suffer the same way ours had. Justice, in this measured form, had been served. We sat together at the kitchen table, the air thick with unspoken emotions. "I know nothing can undo what happened," Stella whispered, voice barely audible. But I want to try. I want to make amends where I can. Her words carefully. Making amends would not erase the betrayal, but it could rebuild fragments of trust. The road ahead would be long, and the wounds would not heal overnight. But acknowledgement and effort were necessary first steps. Brent added softly, I want to learn from this and be better. His admission was quiet, but the weight behind it carried the sincerity of someone finally understanding the cost of their choices. I nodded. It begins with truth, accountability, and patience, I said. The rest is work, and you both will need to be consistent. Every action counts now. That afternoon, I returned to my study and placed the binder carefully on the shelf. It had served its purpose. Proof of generosity, proof of manipulation, and a record of the reckoning that had begun. It was no longer a weapon, but a reminder that vigilance, honesty, and patience were the measures of both justice and family. The house settled into a calm rhythm. Conversations were cautious but real, and the tension that had coiled through the walls slowly loosened. While the scars of betrayal remained, framework for repair was in place. Trust would take time to rebuild, but the first, most critical steps had been taken. As I stood by the window that evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt a rare clarity. The storm of deceit and betrayal had passed, leaving behind the quiet, fragile work of restitution and reconciliation. And in that fragile peace, I realized that while life might never be the same, it could still be navigated with integrity, vigilance, and care. The chapter closed not with victory or revenge, but with something steadier. Accountability faced, lessons learned, and the first tentative steps toward a future rebuilt on truth.